Welcome to Mental Disabilities and the Criminal Justice System. I'm Elizabeth Kelley. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I specialize in representing people with mental disabilities like autism spectrum disorder, dementia, and serious mental illnesses. On this podcast, we provide information and hope to people with mental disabilities ensnared in the criminal justice system, as well as to their families. And today we are talking to someone who works in that space. Indeed, she's in the eye of the hurricane. That's Lisa Lawler, the founder of the White Collar Wives Project. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me today.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate how busy you are. In 2 minutes or less, tell us what the White Collar Wives Project is and why you started it.
Well, I began the White Collar Wives Project because of my story. About a dozen years ago, my now ex-husband embezzled $2.5 million from a prominent teaching hospital in New England. Fortunately, most of those funds were returned, but that did not negate him going through the legal process, being sentenced to prison for 2 years and probation for 5 years, and restitution of the funds that were not recovered, which was probably in the neighborhood of $350,000. We were separated at the time of his investigation, thank goodness, and I went on to divorce him. And a few years later, I started blogging about my experience because it was so traumatic to have been betrayed on that level, financially, familially, in every way possible. And I began hearing from a lot of other women who were going through it or had been through it years earlier and were also looking to connect. And from that, hearing some of their stories of what they had been through with the legal system, not that any of these women were guilty of any crimes, but certainly their husbands' crimes and penalties for those crimes affected them severely, either through civil asset seizure and forfeiture or, of course, emotionally, and in the public purview, and also in their work. A lot of these women, their husbands' cases made headlines, and they were ostracized even from coworkers and their bosses. So it's almost as if there's no corner to run to that's not, doesn't have a spotlight or a target on their back. So from there, doing this advocacy work, I developed a support group, and that support group, at first there were 4, then 6, and now we are into triple digits from women, innocent spouses from 4 continents. I wrote a book, The White Collar Wives Survival Guide, which you were wonderful to promote a few years ago, had me on your show. Thank you so much. And, the work goes on. I do consulting for these women who have no idea which way to go. They've got a government that is coming after them zealously for their own portion of untainted assets to pay for their husband's restitution. And it is just a never-ending nightmare. This life-changing event is not only changes the perp's life forever, but their family members as well. It goes on more often than people would like to think. I've had very high-profile clients, and I've had women that never in a million years thought that their upstanding physician husband would pull off Medicare or commit Medicare fraud. So my clients run the gambit, as do these crimes.
Lisa, some of our listeners may be wondering, why on earth is Elizabeth talking to someone from something called the White Collar Wives Project? Tell us how mental issues can impact a white collar case, be it on the part of the accused, the innocent spouse, as you refer to him or her, or the family.
I think mental health, I think people, for one, take good mental health for granted. And sometimes it's something that, we see white collar crimes, as I said, performed across all sectors of business, including the medical field. And it's interesting, whenever I have a new potential group member reach out to me or a client, one of the first things out of their mouths are that, he's such a narcissist, or they'll ask me, is my husband a sociopath? And, I wrote a blog recently about that very thing. People constantly asking me if white collar criminals are sociopaths. And I'm not a clinician. It's not my call to make, but certainly there are many associated traits of antisocial behavior among the population of men and women who commit white collar crimes. These are people that are usually already financially well off. There's no real urgent need for more. In fact, I call this phenomenon of the epidemic or pandemic of white collar crime more disease. And so, the conversation often goes towards mental health. And in my husband's case, I know that he was interviewed and his attorney brought in a psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist to consult. And they determined that he had bipolar disorder. And, I had lived with this man for 25, 27 years and knew he had some issues, but I would not have chosen bipolar disorder as one of his issues. So it becomes interesting.
If I can interject,
Sure.
It's been my experience that white collar defendants, usually very, very successful people, spend a lifetime masking their symptoms. And in the case of someone with bipolar disorder, it's their highs, it's their periods of mania that have made them so productive, so successful. And they don't want to lose that edge.
What's interesting in my understanding of bipolar disorder, again, I'm not a clinician, those swings, those highs and lows are prevalent. I do know that in rare cases, and maybe not so rare, that swing is not always there. Some with bipolar disorder are always on the high or always on the low. Runs the gambit. But we can't discount the fact that although mental health disorders and conditions do affect our working lives and our personal lives, but not all white collar criminals suffer from a mental disorder. And that's kind of where but
if I could interject again, irrespective of any type of issue or diagnosis, just the trauma of going through the criminal justice system, and in particular, if they're convicted and they have to serve a prison sentence, that creates its own trauma, its own set of challenges.
Yes, of course. I have talked to several ex-cons who have come out and have called me and said, what do I do now? And although that's not my area of expertise, I am compassionate towards their fate, towards what they're facing now, because it's very difficult to get gainful employment as an ex-con. But I also have to, as an advocate for innocent spouses and children, the mental anguish I see among that population is immense. I've seen college kids drop out of school, have nervous breakdowns. I've seen women have nervous breakdowns over this and ended up in hospitals. It is, as you say, the anguish, the mental anguish is real. The hopelessness at times is real. And when you live in trauma for this long periods of time, it does affect your brain function. So, this is why I take a holistic approach in my work in dealing with the entire family. Oftentimes I will consult with couples on how to get through this together if possible. I am first and foremost family, centric. But oftentimes some of these cases are so egregious that and the betrayal so deep, it is time to move on. But yeah, the mental anguish across the lines in the family are horrific.
Well, when you used the phrase earlier, how to get through it together, what are some of the strategies that you give to families?
Well, one of the things I will say, and if there's any legal people listening, which I'm sure it's your audience, I'm kind of going out on a limb here. But in terms of what I suggest, these women, the innocent spouses, the non-offending spouses, are dealing with losing everything they've spent a lifetime building. So what happens is, a perp will be under investigation, and even before a formal indictment, formal accusation has come across the lines, the government will often begin seizing bank accounts and putting liens on homes. I have got many women in my group who had no idea that anything was amiss until they went to use a credit card at an ATM machine and the card was swallowed up, left with the pennies or dollars in their wallets. So I do think that protecting the innocent spouse and children first is paramount, and that means divorce. Now, a lot of women will say, I couldn't possibly divorce my husband. This is his time of need. I must stand by him. And I say to them, I'm just talking from a legal standpoint to make sure you don't end up in the streets. Protect your own assets. It's not up to the courts to say whether or not you can divorce your husband. What you can't do is fraudulently convey assets, meaning you're going to take all the assets between you and your husband. No, you're going to take what's yours, which is half in most states. And that's it, because that's all the feds can take anyway from the offending spouse, is half of what they own, what they share property with and within the marriage. The other part of it is, if you want to stand by your husband, fine, but legally, you've got to protect yourself financially through the legal system. Otherwise, you're at risk of losing everything. I don't judge. One of the things we talk about when new group members come in, women who remain and want to remain married to their spouses, we don't judge either way. That's not what we're there to do. We're there to support each other through. And that's worked really well from us. It was tough in the beginning because a lot of the women felt so betrayed by their husbands, which they were. But at the same time, we're all kind of going through the same issues together. And so, yeah, all these years later, it's worked out very well. We don't judge. If someone wants to remain married for whatever reason, that's their business. It's just nothing that we get involved in.
Lisa, you've used the term husband and wife many, many times. This may seem like a silly question, but if, for instance, a man comes to you and says his wife has been indicted, will you work for that family given those circumstances?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We had that conversation years ago. The reason it's the White Collar Wives Project is because the majority of really all the people that reached out to me were wives.
Sure, and that reflects the reality of the criminal justice system at this point in time.
I think there's been a lot written about the fact that, and I think Kelly Paxton with her Pink Collar Crime, has pointed this out several times. It's her work, that women, she believes in her data research, that women actually commit more white collar wives than men, but they do it in lesser values, meaning that, reflecting our society, there are fewer women in high positions of having access to huge sums of money than there are men. Now, I don't happen to believe that's true.
It's an interesting analysis.
It is. It truly is. But I think that, from the pool of people that I know of, have had direct, contact with, who have committed these crimes, they're stockbrokers, they're financial planners, they're doctors, they are in charge of huge governments. So it kind of, we have women today that are doing all of the same thing, insurance fraud, Medicare fraud. So it is interesting. And at some point, someone will and should compile that data, and from a sociological standpoint, break that down. Are women really less or more adverse to not following the line or not crossing the line? So yeah, from a sociological standpoint, that would be a wonderful study to get our hands on.
But in other words, you would work with a husband if, in fact, he were the innocent spouse.
Oh yes, and I have. definitely we had that conversation in group years ago of whether or not we would, because we are the White Collar Wives project, not meant to be exclusionary, it's just we're the wives.
No, and I didn't want anyone to turn off.
Oh, no, I completely get it. Oh, no. I've had men reach out to me, husbands reach out, innocent spouse husbands reach out. But for some reason, they don't feel comfortable coming into the group for whatever reason. But yeah, the group, we had that conversation years ago. They're more than welcome.
Backing up a few moments ago, I asked you about some of the strategies that you suggest to families who are going through the trauma of a white collar charge. You talked about counseling the innocent spouse to retain a couple of different types of attorneys. Anything else that you suggest to the family?
Well, I certainly think that, the stigma attached to being so closely associated to a financial criminal is daunting. I suggest that they circle their wagons, close friends, your children's close friends, the parents of your children's close friends, explain what's happening, highlight the fact that it's not their fault that this happened, and go from there. Because the moment you start hiding and skulking around, that's the way it's going to be from there on out. It's very difficult to climb out of that hole that we often, dig ourselves. But the stigma is enormous for families of white collar criminals, because there is such a stigma around people that steal money who already have plenty of money. And it's understandable that the public takes that view. So I do believe in holding your head high, meeting it head on rather than hiding, which we're all inclined to do when this happens. It's embarrassing. It's a horrific thing to have happen. We can say, well, gosh, at least nobody's dead, but that still doesn't, get you off the hook publicly. And one of the reasons that I started doing this advocacy work as well was to hopefully destigmatize not offending spouses and children. We've had several cases where children have been completely ostracized because parents of their friends have said, no, you can't hang around with Billy anymore because his father's going to prison for a financial crime. We see an awful lot of that, and it's unfortunate. So I think getting the word out, closing your circles, and letting everyone know that look, the children aren't to blame. Certainly the wife is not to blame. But if you ask the IRS, the wife is to blame, because even if she unknowingly benefited from any ill-gotten funds, she's got to pay the piper.
Yeah, well, that's a different conversation.
It's a whole other story. Yes, yeah.
But I want to go back to your work with the families. Do you suggest that they get any type of counseling or treatment separate and apart from your support groups?
Yes, absolutely. Counseling for children is paramount to their getting through this ordeal.
And how do you do that? Do you do an internet search for family therapy / white collar crime, or
no,
do you have some people you recommend?
I don't ever recommend attorneys, and I don't recommend, or rarely recommend, attorneys. I do not recommend mental health workers. That's something I lead them in the right direction, which is toward trauma therapists, trained trauma therapists. And trauma is trauma, and they have the skills and the expertise to guide families through that. I actually had my son see an at-risk counselor for a while after his dad was arrested. It's just kind of you go that extra mile for your kids, because this is a long process. From investigation to indictment can take years. I have women in my group from early on that even once their husband and their father's child went to prison, their plan was to say, Daddy's working overseas for the next couple of years. And let me tell you, and I wrote about it in my book, The White Collar Wife Survival Guide, children do not like to be lied to, because that is another form of betrayal in their minds. They'd rather have bad news, those that are old enough to understand it. They'd rather have bad news than be lied to. So that line, you think you're protecting your child, but you're not. You end up doing more damage. And we see
Well,
that
and I
time
can
and
only
again.
imagine how devastated and betrayed the child feels if later on it's revealed that indeed daddy or mommy is not away working overseas.
Yeah, one of the big things that I put an emphasis on for women is as upset and angry as they are and betrayed as they are by their partner, that they, unless there's threat of physical harm, I am a real advocate for children being connected and staying connected to their parent, either way, whoever that may be, the offending parent, because that relationship, the parent-child relationship, is very different than the marital relationship. And I remember my son saying at one point, after being able to spend a considerable amount of time with his dad after jail, he came back from that trip and hugged me and said, "Mom, thank you for letting me, be with dad." And I thought, well, you don't have to thank me, but it's true. He knew the sacrifice that was, how deeply hurt I was by what he had done, but that it was not going to cross over into my son's relationship with his father.
Let's back up a minute and talk about preserving the parent-child bond.
Sure.
Do you recommend that children visit their parents if they're incarcerated?
This is a hot button in our group among my population, in that I always advocate to take the child's lead on that. While I'm certainly, pro keeping in touch via telephone, snail mail, email, I think that prison visits can be quite traumatic for children of age. Younger children, not so much. It's not fun for them, but but for older children who have known their parent for many, many years, not behind bars, it's jarring, it's upsetting, it's debilitating even at times. So I think, depending on length of the prison term, I think that should be done through counseling with the family, so that the child is really heard and can flush through all the feelings. If there are negative feelings, flush those out, examine them, look at them. And the main goal, of course, is to make sure that there is a connection upon reentry with the parent and child.
And the flip side of that is, some people, at least going into prison, are emphatic about the fact that they don't want any family members, in particular their children, to see them in those circumstances.
Yeah, and that's, it was a tough decision that we had to make, even though my husband and I were divorced at the time. We had had long conversations about whether or not our son would see him in prison. Fortunately, he didn't end up going to prison. He actually was in jail during the pendency of his trial plea, which took 11 months. But when he was arrested and went to jail, he was in our town for a week before the agents from Massachusetts came to sweep him up and shackle him up and put him on a commercial jet and flew him back to Boston. So I did ask my son. I remember picking him up from school, told him the news that we knew was coming sooner or later. We had waited 3 years for that news, that Dad has finally been arrested. And I asked him, and he said, "Let me think about it, Mom." And literally, he went to his room and came back 20 minutes later and said, I can't. I just can't do it.
And how old was he at the time?
At that time, he was 13 when we first finally told him about the investigation. And he was nearly 16 when his father was arrested. So really, truly old enough to make that decision. He knew that this was looming, and we had magical thinking for a long time, thinking, well, maybe they've forgotten about it. Maybe this isn't really going to happen. And of course, we know that doesn't happen. But yeah, it was his decision. We talked it through. Of course, my ex-husband was disappointed, but was completely supportive of our son's decision. And the moment he got out, which was right after Thanksgiving, right before Christmas, 2011, put my son on a plane, and his dad picked him up, and they went off on a ski trip. in Vermont. So that was a wonderful time together. That was a great kind of reconciliation time for them, doing something they'd always loved to do together.
Unfortunately, Lisa, we need to wrap up in a few minutes, but very quickly, I know that White Collar Wives Project offers some other resources. Tell our listeners about that.
Well, certainly, the resources, the main resource is the group, being with others that have been through this. There's a great empowerment in supporting others in something so deeply ingrained and so tragically upsetting and life-changing.
And you do some work with deterrence, correct?
I do. I have developed a series called, well, it's funny, we really want to get to the cause and effect of this. So I developed a web series called A New Perspective on Deterrence. And I do offer, and I have given webinars to corporations and professional associations, and the feedback is incredible. It's like, we had no idea that this was going on behind the scenes. But I talk about something that I've developed called external deterrence theory. And this is kind of a real departure from the traditional deterrence of, getting caught and punished. That just goes in ear one ear out the other. You have to make learning experiential at this point. I talk about compartmentalized ethics, really and truly getting to the core of prevention. And so this is the turn the White Collar Wives Project is taking now, doing prevention work and getting to the nitty gritty. Lisa Monaco, the assistant AG, is demanding that more compliance programs, or that all compliance programs place an emphasis on the human condition, the human component of prevention. So that's the direction we're headed in now.
Wonderful, wonderful work. And if people want to reach you and or learn more about you, where should they go and what should they do?
They can go directly to the whitecollarwivesproject.org. They can read about the White Collar Wives Project work. There are testimonials from some of the women that have been through this grueling process. They can get my book from the website, direct link to Amazon. They can find out more about the web series, A New Perspective on Deterrence, and my blog is there.
All right, wonderful, wonderful resources. Lisa Lawler, founder of the White Collar Wives Project, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Elizabeth.